So, what could possibly link my book that I'm writing at the moment, Tartan Snow, Battle for the Peace, with my previous volumes, Wartime Christmas, and more recently, Gulag to Spitfire? Well, quite a lot of it happens. So let's delve into the historical bit first of all. I got to know about skiing through my late father, who was both a skier and a ski jumper before the war in Poland. And that was prior to him being arrested and sent to Siberia by the Russians, escaping, walking to Iran, then joining the Royal Air Force. Sadly, he never skied again. But there is an odd link. I really wanted to go skiing. We were too hard up to do anything of the sort. We were a family of 8. That's my mum and dad. I was the eldest of 6. With what happened so often with Polish fighter pilots, nobody wanted to know about them at the end of the war. Professional or not, he was never going to earn a large salary. So skiing was out, apart from grabbing some corrugated plastic back in the cold winter of 1963 and wiring them onto my feet and using them in the snow at a place called Hollingbury on the outskirts of Brighton. But the desire was there, and I eventually did get to learn how to ski when I was in air traffic control at Gatwick. So there was a link with the aviation and skiing at that point. But the interesting thing is, a lot of my supervisors and watch leaders, many of them I should say, had seen service during the war. Some of them not quite so extreme as my father, but others had seen horrors. My lovely old supervisor at Gatwick, Dick Barnby, was very much an old colonial type who was brought up in India and eventually flew the hump, as it was called, from India, clipping the top of Burma and over the Himalayas to Kuching in China, delivering war material, and very dangerous it was too. And if you want an idea of how dangerous it could be, I strongly recommend you to read Ernest Gann's excellent book, Fate is the Hunter, which goes into it in some detail. Make no mistake, you would just as like to dive flying transport aircraft as you would flying fighters or bombers. And indeed, if you look at the training records during the war, so many young men on all sides died training before they even got to an operational squadron. But I digress slightly. I got myself posted to Shanwick Oceanic Control in Prestwick in order to be nearer the skiing. Shanwick Oceanic actually dealt with all the flights across the Atlantic. It was complex, and I'll tell you about it another time. And there was one tragic incident which pretty well wiped me out, and that's another story. But as for skiing, my watch leader, a lovely man called George, who was shot down over Germany, telling me that a night fighter did it, and they saw one night fighter from the rear turret, and they said, "Look out for the one below," just as he said that. As he put it in his own vernacular, all kinds of shit came up through the floor. I believe he was a wireless operator. He was very lucky not to have got killed. So he was the one who put me on the right track for skiing. His daughter was a member of the Glen Ski Club at Rutherglen in Glasgow, and he suggested I ought to join them. And so on the few weekends I was actually off, because we had a rotating shift system, I used to go with the Glen Ski Club, initially up to Glencoe, which I'd never been to before, and then occasionally up to my first love, Cairngorm. And when I eventually left air traffic control, I became a ski instructor on Cairngorm. And that's when I got to hear about the awful things that had happened in Aviemore under George Pottinger and John Polson, who basically were so corrupt over the building of the first Aviemore Centre, And the way that people like Bob Clyde, who was the manager of the Cairngorm lift company, he knew how to do it. And he ran a pretty tight ship. He could be a very abrasive character at times, but the system worked. And Cairngorm really was the place to go. Sadly, it is no longer. We have had a lot of stupidity, back covering, and political ducking and diving. Well, literally millions more than the funicular cost to put in to replace the original chairlift has cost in terms of expenses and repairs, because it's never really worked, and diverting money away from other worthy skiing causes. And Cairngorm now is a shadow of its former self. And the point is that just as we're in an era when there's no corporate responsibility, as sadly has been seen with the post office scandal, we have the same in politics, where people will not own their mistakes and cheerfully spend millions on covering their backs to try and maintain an already damaged reputation. Everybody knows it, but they will carry on anyway, regardless of the damage they are doing in trying to keep white elephants like the funicular going, which will not, at the expense of Scottish skiing. And the same applies in history to a revisionism of World War II. My father, among thousands of other Poles, was betrayed by the so-called victory in Europe, because it was no victory for them. Poland, having been occupied by the Germans and stabbed in the back by the Russians in 1939, was handed over lock, stock and barrel to the Russians as a result of the Yalta Conference. And Stalin demanded that Poland was under his influence, and they did ethnic cleansing to a huge extent in eastern Poland, to such an extent that my father's hometown Lvov no longer exists, as Lvov is now a Ukrainian city called Lviv. And sadly we see the same beginning to happen now in the war in Ukraine. And we delude ourselves by thinking that we're coming up to an anniversary, an 80th anniversary of VE Day, and there are going to be victory parades. But the war was a hollow victory. It did not achieve what it set out to do. We went to war to save Poland. And there is a link here with Tartan Snow, Battle for the Peace. Money was spent to create Scottish skiing and was initially very successful. And there's been a revisionism here, just as there has been revisionism of history with regard to the Poles, who were not allowed to speak about their experiences in Siberia, because the Russians, after 1942, were on our side, weren't they? And by the same token, the politicians who have literally made a mess and appointed cronies into the governing boards, like Highland and Island Enterprise, though I'd love to know where the Enterprise is, and Cairngorm Mountain Limited, are guilty of the same revisionism. The truth of the matter is, authors like me, who have nothing to lose, I have no political reputation to lose, I've no business to lose, and I have no mortgage, so I'm completely free. I can say what I like. Many people are not in that position, and they see damage being done to Scottish skiing in the same way that the Poles and many other veterans at the end of the war saw damage being done and were not empowered to do anything about it. This may seem like stretching it a bit, but believe me, it is not. It is the same process at play, politically and corporately. And you may wonder why I used AI to create such a ridiculous image as the grey man of Ben McDooey destroying the funicular, it is basically the only way I can achieve what amounts to a political cartoon. Political cartoons often summed up complete situations in a way that no amount of narration could, and they stick in the mind, and to some extent dramatised documentaries such as the one Mr. Bates and the Post Office created a stir far more than any news reports, so things started to get addressed with the Post Office scandal. Well, I'm rather hoping that a silly image with a lot of voiceovers from my part to accompany my posts on Facebook, which may yet become podcasts, will have a similar effect. Bring to everyone's notice the injustices that are done historically and today in the names of political expediency and corporate covering your backside. I feel very strongly on this point, and on that bitter note I will leave you.